Good afternoon, dear friends. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Assessment Center course. We have our first class where we talk about what an assessment center is, or they also say assessment center. Although there is a distinction we will also explore with you today. So why would anyone want to learn how to conduct a price assessment? The fact is that employee evaluations are an integral part of a company's talent management system, and experienced appraisers are still keen in short supply, with companies having to pay consultants thousands of dollars or more to appraise each employee. Accordingly, mastering the assessment technique makes you a valuable professional for your company. It makes you look more expensive. Specialists raise your value, so it's a good skill, it's in demand. It's not that it's highly paid and it may not be paid for separately, but it's still important enough nonetheless. And accordingly, taking this kind of training is beneficial. This is the course site, and our course syllabus consists of 6 sessions where you will learn how to fully conduct an assessment. Today we will learn what it is, then we will learn how to determine the requirements for the position, then how to develop assessment center content and plan the assessment. Next, we will talk about how to train the assessment observers, i.e. the assessors, then how to conduct the assessment center itself, and how to proceed after the assessment center. Of course, we will touch on the topic of artificial intelligence because it is such a powerful tool now that helps in so many ways. In the center, for example, you can either develop or adapt the task, exercises of the test with the help of GPT chat. So we're going to talk about that as well. In case we don't know each other, I'll tell you about me. My name is Mike Pritula. The companies I have worked for are Alpha Bank, STB TV channel, Wargaming, Preply IDL, consulted PeopleForce, and created an academy. As a recruiter, I encountered the topic of personnel evaluation back in Alpha Bank. There I was doing interviewing, and to select candidates I was learning what techniques, approaches, and technologies were available to do this, the right way to do it effectively. And I already conducted elements of the assessment center in Alpha Bank when we were recruiting loan officers. We conducted mass interviews and gave very simple exercises to select a few for interviews from a large number of candidates. Then on the TV channel STB assessment, we used it also in the selection of, again, mass employees. And to evaluate our employees, we had categories of creative professionals in there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Using the assessment center tools, we assigned categories. We spent some time there. Well, and we brought in assessors when we needed to evaluate candidates. For example, when we were hiring these directors, we had 3 finalists, and we hired a company to give us a detailed assessment of these 3 candidates. At the time I was working in gamification, I was a HR business partner, and I was spending with a company called DDI, Assessment C, for a group of executives to put together their development plan and then develop them according to that plan that I conducted. In the PDL, we used again the assessment center elements to select candidates. That is, in general, the center, its methodologies, tools have played a good service to me. Different companies have been helpful. Well, of course, I recommend you do too, because you won't find a more accurate way to evaluate a candidate or employee. Let's move on. This is a little bit of information about me as a coach, as an expert. If we don't know someone, I have publications in the magazine, even on the cover. I have all sorts of degrees. There are proceeds at conferences, at international conferences, then rankings, nominations, international certificates, all sorts of things. It's just to introduce myself, well, and the academy, about the academy. It's been almost 30 years. A great many people we have trained. We have such a very active international expansion right now. So too has been around for a long time. There are awards too. Relying on best practices, from the very beginning of my career, I have been guided on the one hand by personal experience, and on the other hand by leading projects, and to develop, on the other hand, on all kinds of best practices in order to make sure that the way I act is right, it corresponds to the best approaches. I teach in my courses too. On the one hand, this is my personal experience. On the other hand, it's best practice. In those of you who watch this YouTube video, I'm going to ask you to write in the comments who you are, where you work. And homework. In this course, we have homework. I check them, give feedback, and doing your homework will get you our diploma. Our credential is submitted digitally on the cable platform as a certification similar to HCI or CRM or other certification. I mean, we take it seriously. Today we're going to talk about what is the essence of technology centers in assessment, what are the key features, how were they born, how did they evolve, where do you start, why are they the most accurate, how do you justify it to the company, should we engage consultants, and the topic of evolution will also be touched on today. In additional materials, you will have a presentation of a case study of assessment centers in wargaming as supplementary material for self-study. Okay, here we go. What is the essence of assessment center technology or assessment centers? The term itself comes from the name of a place in the United States where AT evaluated the managerial potential of hundreds of its employees. They came up with the idea of calling it an assessment center and conducted employee evaluations there to identify who might make a good manager. An assessment center can last from a few hours to several days, depending on its purpose. It can also be a development center if the assessment results are used to support the participants' individual growth. Most centers, but not all, use various exercises that simulate real-life situations. I'd like us to clearly understand the essence, beyond just studying the theory of different approaches. And the essence of an assessment center is very simple. It's to see how a person handles a role, but instead of moving them into that role and observing for a long time like during a probationary period, an assessment center is created where everything is compressed into 1 or 2 days, very concentrated, allowing for quick conclusions. The assessment center saves you 3 to 6 months, because managers' probationary periods can last 6 months, not 3 like for specialists, and allows you to see how a person would perform their job with high accuracy. In these 2 days, you can get an idea of how a person will perform in the position they're being evaluated for. Fundamentals. The original British Assessment Centre model consisted of a series of interviews and paper versions of aptitude tests. Initially, simulation exercises, tasks that mimic future job duties like conducting a meeting with an employee, were only a small part of the 3-day evaluation procedure, but their importance was quickly recognized. Some assessment centers may include peer feedback options, what we call 360-degree feedback. Some contain elements of participant self-assessment, while others may use psychometric tests, for example tests from companies like SHL. While in other centers, none of these elements are present, so assessment centers can vary widely. In my experience too, they've been quite diverse. Different approaches were used for different positions and different objectives. Let's continue. All assessment centers try to assess a person's competence relative to their past job, current job, but most often in relation to the future job they're applying for. We can evaluate past work within the assessment center. For example, to conduct a performance review with employees in cases where it's difficult to evaluate their work directly. Let me give you an example. This is exactly what we did at the STB TV channel. We evaluated TV project camera operators. To give a specific example, these are the guys who walk around with cameras. Everyone has seen how it looks. They walk, stand, and run with cameras, steadicams, and so on. And looking at what an operator filmed last year is not entirely relevant, because first you'd need to watch absolutely everything they filmed. And camera operators film for very long hours. Then a small piece is cut out, but operators shoot for many hours. And the director tells the camera operator what to shoot. So the director sets the task. Operators often don't decide for themselves what they're going to shoot. The camera operator's work depends on how the lighting technician set up the lights, and so on. So there are many nuances. Therefore, it's difficult to assess an operator's work based on past performance. And there aren't really any KPIs or metrics, it's creative work. So to evaluate the operators, we set up scenes. Yes, there was peer assessment to evaluate operator behavior, but there was also a test assignment. The chief operator came up with about 20 exam-like scenarios. Each scenario represented a frame from a famous movie, and the evaluation was conducted in a special room with television equipment. There was an actor, and the task was to set up the shot to match the movie frame as closely as possible. They had to set up the lighting, position the camera in a specific way, apply filters, and so on. So it was quite a serious task. And that's how people were evaluated. All assessment centers focus on behavior, on what a person actually does. Behavior is the starting point in designing procedures and exercises, as you try to assess exactly the behavior needed to function successfully in a particular position. Next, key features. Assessment centers are a multiple assessment process, meaning they usually involve several different tools. This multiplicity is evident in 5 main characteristics. First, a group of participants. That is, an assessment center is most often conducted for a group, not just one person. Participants perform various exercises, not just a single exercise. Under the supervision of a team of trained observers, meaning not just one person observes, but several, who evaluate each participant on a set of predetermined job-related behavioral indicators, so it's not just one behavior being assessed, but a set. Finally, evaluation decisions are made through joint discussion of all data obtained among the observers. This is how the multiplicity manifests itself. Multiple participants. Yes, sometimes it's for one participant, but most often it's for 4 to 6, maximum 12. So these are usually group activities. Next, a combination of methods. The centerpiece of most assessment centers are tests or simulation exercises. That is, simulations based on the specific job for which candidates are being selected. The goal is to replicate that work as closely as possible. The goal is to get a complete picture of the full spectrum of a candidate's ability. And additionally, interviews, psychometric tests may be conducted. Usually 2 instruments are used to assess each competency. We'll be talking about that further too. There is a rule of thumb that there must be at least 2 instruments in a competency assessment to accurately assess the instrument. Next, this is how, for example, the competency assessment grid by tool looks like for some position. We make a list of competencies. How to make them we will talk about in the class next. We have a set of different activities and tools in the assessment, and then we decide what competency with what tools we can assess. Here somewhere we'll see 4 instruments, somewhere we'll see 3, somewhere it'll be 2, that's the minimum, so on and so forth. 3, 2, 2, 4, 4. A team of observers is also a very important prerequisite. Ideally, the observer should see all participants, but not more than one exercise. There should be a balance of psychologists or HR managers or line managers in the supervisory team. It's really important that it's not just HR that does the assessment, but managers as well. All of them are required to undergo appropriate training. So we will have one session devoted to training the observer, a behavior-based method based on performance analysis. Job analysis means looking at what the representative of the OEDness is doing in development prior to the development of SSM, helps us to identify what it is that differentiates the work of those who are successful in this position from those who are less successful. The distinction is articulated in a variety of terms, among which may be qualities, parameters, criterion, or competencies, and the purpose of job analysis is to determine which of the factors are most important for successful job performance. We will talk about this in the next session, how it is conducted, collaborative discussion of the data. Observers discuss the data collected and make decisions. The observer team comes together to simultaneously analyze all data about the participant. No prior discussions are held. This is also very important because as we are evaluating a person's behavior, it can be very subjective. And so, when a team of observers discusses a particular employee in a particular exercise, they argue their case for the grade and they cite evidence. They say, I think this is a person of such and such competence, has such and such a grade because right there and there, he showed himself this way, that way. Another person says, observer, what I think is not so, and then something of his own. The origin of the center in the assessment. Assessment centers were invented in Europe, not in America, although this is commonly believed. For example, the Admiralty Admissions Office was formed in the year 1942 and used the same designs as other branches of the armed forces, especially the War Department Selection Board in the Army. These developments were preceded by a similar approach to officer selection in Germany. Well, it is true that, let's just say that the world of modern business, the capitalist world that you and I live in, it is relatively recent. That is, large organizations, literally as recently as 100 years ago, they were state institutions, such as military formations. Therefore, many of the tools originated primarily in the military and public administration. Only then did they come into the business. The direction of psychometric testing was actively developed. Selection and testing techniques have begun to produce significantly better results than the most universal method of interview selection. Wartime. We had to find a method of identifying people who could learn the necessary skills quickly and had the potential to develop them. The doughy abilities, we call them. There was a high turnover among officers who could not lead people, and psychologists developed a method of selecting officers who could lead people. The basis was to study behavior as a measure of success while doing the job and using multiple sources of data when deciding from pain. Center growth in assessment. In 1944, the Strategic Research Service, later what is now the CIA, adopted a method of selecting intelligence officers. The English approach consists of long quizzes and the American ones of role-playing and individualized business exercises. For example, the likes of basket we'll be looking at too, without the long writing assignments. The start of commercial centers in the evaluation occurred in the company is the American company AT. It's a telecom company, a cell phone company. It was then, or rather it wasn't a cell phone, it's a cell phone now. Back then it was just an operator, a telephone operator. What's next? In the early 50s, the company's objective was to identify people who were capable of a successful management career, regardless of educational background. Why did they start making all this up? Because when all sorts of companies of corporations were booming, it began to become clear that the most successful leaders are not leaders who have some great education above. These are not executives who have gotten some very rich past experience, and often they were people who had nothing much in the past. And for some reason they led perfectly. So the challenge was to understand and how to select such people. Because in fact it was found that there are such people, appoint them from somewhere somehow they come from. And so the goal was to find a way to select these people because they happen to be, roughly speaking, in the company from the 100 appointed executives. 5, 10 was just talent. Cool leadership. But a company cannot appoint 100 new ones every year and discard 95. The challenge was to find those who would be great leaders. And now with the help of the assessment center, it has been achieved. Let's move on. Next, AT created a consulting company specializing in identifying and developing human potential, and it was the predecessor company to DD. DD is generally a very cool company. I was lucky enough to work with them in gaming. They conducted an assessment for us. They have a great methodology and excellent training. And by the way, they trained and passed on their methodology to the staff of the gaming company so that employees could later evaluate themselves. The 60s and 70s of the last century, IBM, Company M, and Max are actively using assessment center technologies. Late 80s. Carrie Schweppes, Ron McIntosh. Now, some companies have already been using assessment centers as a final selection mechanism for graduates. Shell, Philips, Siemens, and other major companies began using assessment centers in the mid-70s. And every year since then, the number of companies using assessment has steadily increased. For example, in 1986, 25% of companies with more than 500 employees used them. In 1989, it was 33%. In 1996, 43%, and so on. Of course, this tool requires expertise and career growth opportunities, which are more available in large companies. Therefore, assessment centers will be conducted more often in larger companies, and the chances of encountering them are higher than in smaller companies. Areas of use? It can be used for screening candidates at entry, for example, when hiring, typically for college graduates, but not necessarily. Assessment center elements can be used for any vacancy. For external candidates for higher positions, identifying candidates for promotion within the company, and staff career development, so it can be a tool to help develop careers. Next, costs and benefits. The cost of assessment centers consists of two things: the cost of development and the cost of conducting a series of evaluations as part of a regular assessment session. This may include personnel-related costs, staff salaries. It can also include costs associated with hiring a company that conducts the assessment and with a company that develops assessment exercises. That's possible. It could be some company like DD that was invited to design effective assessment exercises. Well, that's probably it, plus venue rental. And if we hire a consulting company that conducts the assessment for us instead of doing it ourselves. The benefits include clarity in evaluation criteria, fairness, and acceptance by participants in the assessment, forming an understanding of what the job will entail, objectivity of feedback, opportunity to consider seemingly underqualified candidates. Observers discover many new personnel management issues. Therefore, firstly, it's useful to invite managers and experts. There's a term subject matter expert. Usually, it's someone from the staff who understands the job requirements very well. They develop as they observe. And those HR staff, often recruiters or HR business partners, they also develop their expertise by taking assessment center training and then participating in assessment centers. That is, they start to understand people's behavior better. Where to start? All assessment centers should have a clearly defined purpose, and that purpose should be relevant to fulfilling the organization's mission. That is, you need to understand why you need an assessment center. Clarity of purpose is an important factor, as it can give the assessment center a definite shape and influence many issues related to the center's design and implementation procedure. There are two types of assessment centers: for making simple decisions, for example, whether to hire or not, whether to promote or not, and for diagnosing participants' strengths and areas for development. The process of launching an assessment center from the moment the idea arises takes about 4 months. That's about how long you should expect it to take. Although sometimes it can be faster. For example, we had a task at STB TV channel that was very quick, and we implemented it in probably less than a month. We had a casting department for extras. There were about 50 people working there. The manager of this division changed. The previous manager left for another company, and the new manager needed to understand the team hadn't had any career growth for a long time, there were no salary increases, and discontent was brewing in the team because there were no prospects. And the new manager, from among those same employees, raised this issue with the company's management and HR. We need to establish seniority positions, create a senior casting manager role, for example, and we need to review people's salaries. But in order not to do it for everyone, since clearly some people perform better than others, an assessment center was developed. We took a set of exercises, quickly trained the HR team, their manager, and conducted the entire assessment within a week, then made decisions about salary revisions. There were several components, for example, a role play where they had to convince a potential participant to take part in a show. There were some other things. I remember there was definitely a competency-based interview. I think there was a 360-degree assessment. I cannot remember all the tools. It was a long time ago. It was one of the first serious assessments I conducted. I personally conducted the role play with participants. That was my job as a team member. Validity of the assessment center. So what is validity? It's accuracy. How much you can trust it. For example, we measure temperature in different ways. You can use your hand, but this method isn't valid. You can use different thermometers. The mercury thermometer is considered the most accurate, the most valid. Therefore, when you need to determine temperature very accurately, people often use a mercury thermometer. Then there are digital ones. There are digital armpit ones, there are digital ones that laser measure the forehead, digital laser ones, there are different validity ones, for example. There are ones with an error of 1.5 degrees and little trust. There's no quality, they have a minimal margin of error there. Validity is about accuracy. So here's the center. Validity refers to the degree to which a method works as intended. Prediction validity is calculated by correlating the total score of the participant of the assessment center with the value of a certain performance indicator of his/her further work. So in general, the validity of all instruments in an assessment is considered. For example, how to do it? Look, for example, we hire some employees quite often, for example, sales reps. And sales reps, when they take the assessment, they score differently. But we take the best 10% there is, for example. But among that top 10%, there are some people who perform differently in the interview, and then after a while we can evaluate their performance on the job. So those assessment tools that were used in the selection phase that were able to predict future performance, they are highly disabled. They're calculated easily by calculating the correlation. So you have on your screen different ways of assessing people, and we see that the assessment centers, especially for promotion, have the highest disability. Interviews, for example, have much lower validity. How do you justify the need for an assessment center? For leadership, for example, this gives you a more accurate hiring decision, will save you money from laying off employees who are mistakenly hired or mistakenly promoted, and it gives higher employee productivity because you're hiring the most effective people for the position. Is it worth it to engage consultants to run the center in the assessment? Well, look at the stages you can invite to. You may be invited to the job analysis phase to determine the criteria and competencies against which the appraisal will then be developed. Can be used to develop exercises. Could be for observer training, could be for assessment or development center design. That is, the selection of all the exercises to be used for each competency. You can as an observer, you can as an organizer, you can as an observer discussion organization. So these are essentially the steps of an assessment center. And here you can invite consultants either for all stages or only for a part of some stages, depends on your capabilities and on your experience. How do you choose counselors? Ask how long the consultants have been working in the center's assessment area, who they have provided their services to, and who can recommend them. Do they have experience with assessment or development centers, and what do they see as the difference? Where they have been trained by whom in the area of centers in assessment, do they have any certificates? And ask them to briefly describe the assessment center procedure under development and implementation. Another question, who will they propose to select as observers for the center you envisioned? What ratio of observers to participants would they recommend? From what level in the organization it is better to take observers, by what criteria they recommend to select observers? What books would they recommend you read so that you have a proper understanding of the assessment centers? Evolution centers. By what the center focuses on, we can divide the centers into assessment centers and developmental centers. Assessment centers focus more on selection, such as from outside or promoting their own employees. And the evaluation itself is the end of the process. But we can conduct a development center to identify employee potential and to diagnose a person's strengths and weaknesses at work. And this will be the beginning of the process, that is, the center will not be like the finale, just the beginning. And here's an even more detailed description of the difference if you're in doubt about what you need. A few technologies that can be used are all sorts of psychometric tests. It could be topics, DDI, SHL, but also tools. We in this course explore in detail the center's tools in assessment. This may include competency interviews, professional interviews, motivational interviewing, case solving, professional testing, psychological testing, and various individual and group exercises. On planning skills, skills and decision making, strategy skills, commercial skills, management skills, presentation skills, group work skills, or whatever other skills are still needed for some unique position, assessment center characteristics. Let's summarize. So, a variety of tools to measure a predetermined set of competencies. Each competency is, by the way, you could say, an official such manifesto. We have a center, each competence to be measured by several tools. The toolkit includes individual group activities. Appraisers are trained in appraisal. Each appraiser evaluates 3 to 5 candidates, assessing what is going on there and at that particular time. The assessment should be authentic to the work the candidates are doing or will be doing. All candidates should be treated equally, regardless of ability, gender, religion, or other group characteristics. The assessor must keep evidence that the candidate has knowledge, understanding, skills, or competence that can be used to judge their achievement against agreed standards and criteria. The candidate assessed by the assessor should consistently achieve the same or similar results with different assessors and with the same or similar group of candidates. To minimize bias, evaluators should rotate between candidates. Tools should be actionable, valid, and reliable and should be linked to competence. Instruments must meet the standard criteria by which the candidate is evaluated. Fairness must be ensured so that everyone has an equal chance of receiving an objective, accurate assessment. The tools should be sufficient to measure the set of competencies, and all requirements must be met prior to the assessment. Well, the last point is that the assessment center provides highly relevant, comprehensive, and observable information. It improves the efficiency and fairness of the decision-making process. Its use pays off in the development activities of other competency-based functions. It enhances the organization's image. Assessment Center books. The most famous books are the Assessment Center book by Blanc and Nigel Poff. There's a good book called Assessment Personnel by Assessment Center Method and Assessment Center Step by Step. These three books are pretty good. Homework for those who are on the course with us, and for those who are not yet on the course, I invite you to join. Describe the goals of the Assessment Center for your company, and explain the cost justification for the Assessment Center for your company. Why these costs will pay for themselves. In the second session, we will talk about how to define job requirements, how to understand which competencies should be assessed for the position for which we have decided to run the assessment center. That's all. Thank you for your participation. I'm looking forward to your homework. See you soon. Bye-bye.